Welcome to the UK and Changing Europe lunch hour. We are talking about democracy in the European Union. I'm Simon Usherwood. I'm a senior fellow on the programme. I'm previously a deputy director. I'm very pleased to be joined by an excellent group of colleagues from across Europe who are going to share their thoughts and their wisdom. First up, we've got Sophie Veld, who's a member of Renew Europe in the European Parliament. She is a member of the Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs. And she's also the author of a book that's just been published, Naked Power, which she's going to discuss and is going to, I think, pull up a number of key themes in our discussion. Secondly, we have Janis Emmanouilidis, who's Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies at the European Policy Centre, where he's been for many years. He's also a member of the Scientific Council and Research Associate at ELIMAP. Thirdly, we've got Nguyen, who is, since I think yesterday, Deputy Director at the Jacques Delors Centre. She's Senior Policy Fellow in EU Institutions and Democracy. She's also been involved in the Franco-German expert group on EU institutional reforms, which I think, again, is going to be really useful for our discussion. And last on the list, but not least, is Catherine Barnard, who is also a Senior Fellow at UK and Changing Europe and has also been Deputy Director of the programme. She's a Professor of European and Employment Law at the University of Cambridge. So the format we've got is the standard one for these lunch hour events. You have access to Slido, where you can ask questions. We're going to start off by getting Sophie just to kind of pick up some themes and some ideas from her book. And then I'm going to get colleagues to come in with some thoughts. And then it's over to you to ask us questions and for us to talk about them through the rest of this hour. So, Sophie, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, maybe I'll try and summarize the message of my my book, Naked Power, in a few minutes. Very often when we talk about democracy, we say, democracy is about elections. It's about the voice of the people, about people having the right to vote. And of course, that is true. But elections are not the actual essence of democracy. There are many countries in the world which have elections, but they're not democracies. The real essence is wherever there is power, there is also a countervailing power. Checks and balances. And this is actually, if you go back to something well known to your British audience, the Magna Carta from 1215, that was about that element in particular. Where there's power, it will have to be kept in check. And this is something that we have developed over the centuries. And what I see happening in the European Union is that the European Union is gaining more and more power, but the actual countervailing powers are absent and actually weakened. And this is mainly invisible to people because they don't really understand how the European Union works. It's usually seen as a kind of, a monolith, a blob, where people don't really distinguish between the different institutions. It's usually referred to as Brussels. I've actually even once seen an article in a newspaper with the headline, Brussels has decided so and so. And it turned out it was about the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, not in Brussels. But even that they call Brussels. So people are not very informed, and people believe, and national politicians actually lead them to believe, that it's just a technocratic entity and citizens shouldn't really worry about it and leave it to the national politicians and everything will be all right. But that is, of course, that's a myth or a lie, actually. It's not true. The European Union is profoundly political, and it has been so from the very start. And what we have seen is that over the decades, it has developed more and more in the direction of a parliamentary democracy. And that's a development we saw weakening already by 2004, so about 20 years ago, but certainly from 2019 onwards, and I'll explain that. Because from the very start, there has been involvement of, or there's been a parliamentary dimension, let me call it that way. But it was always national MPs who had, who were doing Europe on the side. Then from 1979 onwards, there's been a directly elected European Parliament, which over the decades has acquired more and more powers. And now the European Parliament actually has very formidable legislative powers. But it's also supposed to act as a democratic watchdog. It's also supposed to hold the European Commission, which is the executive, to account. That is what the treaties say. But what we see happening more and more in times where we have to admit that parliamentary democracy is on the retreat everywhere, also at national level. We see that after COVID, for example, in times of crisis, parliaments take the back seat. The executives, the governments, they get exceptional powers, and this balance of power and countervailing power is disturbed. We see the same happening at European level. A weakened European Parliament, weakened accountability, weakened scrutiny, weakened checks and balances at the very moment when the European Union is actually getting not new formal powers, but entering into new areas like the purchase of vaccines during the pandemic, the collective purchase and provision of arms to Ukraine, Eurobonds, the introduction of Eurobonds. Now we see that the European Union actually should act as a geopolitical actor in the conflict in the Middle East, but isn't doing so well. But also in fighting inflation, capping the energy prices. Very big decisions have been taken. And yet parliamentary scrutiny is close to zero. And that is a very, very worrying development, because I think in the world of today, and this is going to be my conclusion for now, in the world of today, we need a more integrated European Union, not just cooperation, intergovernmental cooperation between governments, but we need a strong European Union. If you see now that Donald Trump is ahead in the polls in all the important, or almost all the important swing states, I mean, Trump too is no longer just a fantasy. It may actually happen. So Europe needs to grow up really fast, and only a democratic Europe with the necessary checks and balances can work. But what we see is that whereas this parliamentary dimension has weakened, we see the European Council of Government Leaders actually expanding its powers, and its powers are unlimited, essentially, because they are described in a very vague manner in the treaties. And government leaders kind of like this situation, because being in the European Council of Government Leaders also gives them some sort of extra status, extra power back home. It's like they're all becoming, little presidents or kings, because they cannot be scrutinized by the national parliament. They can only be partly scrutinized by the European Parliament. So in essence, they have absolute power. Nobody can scrutinize them. Nobody holds them to account. They are not officially accountable to anybody. They're meeting behind closed doors. They're deciding with unanimity, which equals horse trading. They actually, some people like Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, derives a lot of power from the veto he has in the European Council of Government Leaders, power he would not otherwise have without that veto. So we see that the whole construction of the European Council, the Commission, the Parliament is completely skewed now. It's out of balance. And I think it is essential that we restore that balance, that we strengthen the parliamentary dimension. And the first thing that needs to be done is, after the elections in 2024, the European Parliament has to stick to its own candidate for the presidency of the European Commission, so-called Spitzenkandidat, because that should be the first step for Parliament to restore the balance with the European Commission. Okay, I'll stop there, and I'm sure there's more to say in the Q&A.
I think that definitely is. You said in the introduction of your book, and I'd recommend it to everyone listening to have a read of it. You say that democratic renewal is more than a boring theoretical discussion. I don't think it's boring at all, but maybe we go to the wrong dinner parties. Janis, do you want to maybe start off with some thoughts, and then we'll go to two. You're on mute still.
Not that for me, so sorry for that. Yeah. Very interesting, Sophie, to listen to the introduction and to the summary of your book. And obviously, there's much more in it than what you were able to portray. But let me reflect on a couple of points. With respect to the general picture you're portraying, I think I'm in full agreement in terms of what the challenges are and actually what needs to be done. But as we know, the devil always lies in the detail. And thankfully, now we have more of a debate about the need to reform the European Union than we had a couple of years ago, also because of what is happening around us, following the war in Ukraine, the geopolitical constellations which we're witnessing developing in front of our eyes. It's always interesting that we hear people talk about Zeitenwende. I use the word global Zeitenwende, and because it is something which has global effects and is changing our surroundings, is also changing the debate we're having with respect to EU enlargement, and all that is leading to having more of an intensified debates about the need to reform the European Union. And Thu, I'm sure, will be describing and telling us about the discussion they had within the Franco-German group. That is already one indication. The fact that we have that group, that we have these results, that things are moving. Also, the latest report coming from the European Parliament, Verhofstadt et al., which is calling for very concrete reforms of the European Union, I think is pushing in the right direction. There's a lot to discuss in detail. Another point I wanted to mention is that at some point you were saying that you were talking about that parliamentary democracy is under pressure everywhere, in retreat, I think was the word you were using, everywhere. And I think that that's correct, that we need to not only look into democracy at the EU level in a simplistic way, but also look into the state of our democracies within the EU, within the member states, within its 27 components. Let's not forget, the EU is a union of citizens and states. So we also need to look into the state of democracy within the European Union and within the member states. And I think there's a lot where we see that things are moving in the wrong direction. Now we've had the elections in Poland. That was a very positive development, but we see that democracy is under pressure everywhere, even when you look into the US, obviously. So I think that democracy needs to be reformed not only at the EU level, but also the EU level proper, to call it that way, but also to think of how we further develop our democracies at the national level, because there's a strong interplay between the quality or the pressures on democracy at the EU level and in the member states. And I think following the 2024 EP elections, I think we will see how this interplay will work out. My prognosis personally for the EP elections are not very bright. I think that there is a high risk that the turnout will be lower this time as it was in 2019, where I see that there is disagreement. That's very good. I hope that others are right, but I see that there is a danger and that we might have a turnout which will be lower, and that will play into the hands of right-wing nationalist populists. If that's the case, that will also have an effect on how member states are operating, on the discourse in member states, because it will be put pressure on traditional forces in the member states, which will then have an effect at the European level. I just give this as an example, how strongly interlinked these different elements are with each other. And the last point I want to make is with respect to the role of the European Council, because that was something which you very much highlighted, Sophie, in terms of things moving in the wrong direction. I think there's some truth to that, but it has also to do, and that's another moment in the EU policy-making process where you see how the links are between the EU and member states. We have many weak governments in the member states, complex governments, coalition governments, minority governments. And I think that also the weaknesses of national governments have an effect in the European Council. And I think that that effect is not strengthening the ability of the EU, in this case, the heads of state and government and the Commission president, let's not forget that she is also part of the European Council, to come up with decisions which are equal to the level of challenges which we're facing, and I was putting this very diplomatically now. So I think also the weakness of the European Council often has to do with the weaknesses of member states and national governments at home. Look into the weakness of the German government. I say that's being half German. Look into the weakness of President Macron. That all this is not playing into how the EU machinery works, besides the factors, Sophie, which you were already mentioning, but it also has an effect, for example, on the interplay between the Commission president and the president of the European Council, which there are personal differences among them. There's no secret about that, obviously, and if you operate in Brussels, you see it very vividly. But there's also something structurally which we need to think of in terms of, how things and the interplay between these two presidents work or doesn't work. And I don't see that we're having this debate. No, we're not actually thinking about what happens after the EP elections in terms of the interplay between institutions. We have the old, I think it was, Sophie, you were talking about horse trading. Is already playing out, that horse trading of who gets what, which political colors, geography, male, female, all these considerations, whereas we're not thinking structurally what we should have learned out of the last years and the experiences since the entry to Lisbon of the Lisbon Treaty and the interplay between the two presidents across Rue de la Loi. So there are many dimensions, I think, which we need to think of, and I could mention more, but I'll stop it here because I've already talked too long.
Thank you. Yes. Two.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Sophie, for this introduction to your book and for your book. I read it with much interest, and there's a lot that really resonates. So I'm very happy to be here. I was also asked to perhaps briefly touch upon the report that also has been mentioned, the Franco-German report on EU institutional reform to prepare for enlargement, which of course also includes a chapter on democracy and democratic legitimacy. And why we discussed our mandate and the report and this question of reforming the EU, and I think you're very right, Janis, that enlargement, the question of enlargement has really put the question of reform back on the agenda and has made it possible, in fact, to speak much more deeply about reforming the European Union than was possible a few years ago. We also then thought about what are the main points that we need to touch upon in this report. And for those who have seen the report, we have this triangle of three goals. And one is really getting the EU institutions enlargement ready. One is increasing the EU's capacity to act. So ensuring that you can act even with more member states. And then the third one, very importantly, is protecting the rule of law and enhancing democratic legitimacy, because that is the basis for everything that EU does. And if we talk about more powers and increasing capacity to act, of course, it needs to be then accompanied by a protection of the values and of the democratic procedures. So also for us, this was quite in the forefront of our discussions. And personally, I think there's two very important points or dates coming up. One is, of course, the European elections, and you have mentioned this, Sophie, and the question also of the Spitzenkandidaten and the appointment of the Commission president. And I think here, and I fully agree, it really will be the most important question or task to avoid the same institutional turf battle that we had in 2019. And whether it is by prior agreement or whether it is by not necessarily employing the Spitzenkandidaten procedure, I think the most important part is to have an agreement before and not to go into the elections with this agreement between the different institutions and then ending up in the same messy situation that we had in 2019. And then I think that the second big point in time or big question that comes up for democracy is enlargement itself. and not just how to organize European democracy once we become bigger and we have more member states. And it is, of course, about the question of how big should the European Parliament be and how do we organize the composition of the Commission and the Parliament, but also more broadly, how do we engage the citizens, both in the EU countries and the candidate countries in this discussion? How do we ensure that there's a broad democratic basis and a broad societal basis in the discussion? And also here we made, for example, one suggestion in the report saying that when we strengthen participatory democracy instruments in the European Union, we should also think about how to include the citizens of candidate countries in these instruments to bring more ownership into the process, to get the views more aligned and also get the citizens on both sides on board to say this is actually something that is important and that we need to discuss on all levels, not just the governmental level. And this is also then where it relates back to the EU elections, that it can already be something that we discuss in the European elections. And I know you said in the beginning that the elections are not the only point about democracy, and I fully agree that it is about the balance of the institutions. At the same time, I think when we look at enlargement and the link to democracy, I think that European Parliament elections will be an important time both to engage the citizens, but also to give the European Commission, the next one, a mandate as to how do we go about this and what reforms would we like to tackle in the next legislative cycle, and where do we put the priorities. And I will stop here for now.
Okay, thanks very much. Just for those in the audience who don't know about Spitzenkandidaten, we berate you for not paying enough attention to European democracy, but this is the process whereby the different groups in the European Parliament put forward a lead candidate, a Spitzenkandidat, and the candidate that has the most backing on the basis of the European elections then goes on to be the president of the European Commission. This is more or less the idea. How it actually works is several more lunchtime discussions, because we kind of come and gone on that, to put it politely. Catherine.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to make 3 points. First of all, to thank Sophie for her very honest and readable book, which I would thoroughly commend. My first point is the issue about the rise of executive power, which, as she rightly says, is a global phenomenon. And certainly speaking for the United Kingdom, for all the talk about take back control to Parliament, what we've actually seen is take back control to Whitehall, which is the shorthand for significant powers going to the executive, and indeed an increasing number of acts of parliament, so our primary legislation, confers really quite dramatic powers on the executive. And when the executive acts, there is virtually zero scrutiny in practice. And one of the probable explanations for this is that notions of sovereignty, autonomy, whatever language you want to use, is becoming quite a theme in a number of countries, and this idea that somehow there has got to be control of extraterritorial institutions, but the control isn't through parliaments, it is entirely through the executive and how the executive responds. So that's my first point. My first point is that, yes, you're absolutely right. The executive is trumping the democratically elected institutions in a number of places. My second point is whether the European Parliament itself needs to look closely at what it does and how it presents itself. And I'm sorry if this comes across as rude or aggressive, but I think I've always thought that there is a lack of visibility of the European Parliament and what it does. I think the communications from the European Parliament do not speak effectively to a much wider audience outside those who are interested. I think it's unfortunate because partly, of course, because of the language issue that translation has to take place, there isn't a robust debate that goes on in Parliament with personalities that you can see that the press can latch onto, and there can be an engagement. I also think that the trilogue process, while it has much to commend itself, in terms of trying to get things done is really a shortcut on full democratic scrutiny. And again, this language of trilogue, unless you are a Brussels nerd, really means nothing at all. And so for all of these extra powers the European Parliament has got, whether they've actually, the citizens can understand what the Parliament is doing is not at all clear to me. And to put it bluntly, I'm not sure that the Parliament itself is very good at explaining itself what it's doing and why it's relevant. My third point goes back to the question of checks and balances. And I agree, of course, entirely that democracy is more than just about elections. And the check and balance that's not been mentioned so far today is the role of the European Court of Justice. Now, for those of you who are not lawyers, the European Court of Justice, as Sophie said, sits in Luxembourg, not to be confused with the European Court of Human Rights, which sits in Strasbourg. And yes, the European Court of Justice has done some quite remarkable things, and in some areas has been quite progressive. But in one key area, over the question of checks and balances, I think the European Court of Justice has failed the citizens significantly. And that is, it's almost impossible for citizens to bring proceedings before the Court of Justice in order to challenge the legality of a piece of legislation. This has been a problem since the famous or infamous Plowman decision from the mid-1960s. And despite the fact that that decision is nearly 60 years old, the Court of Justice has not reversed it despite repeated criticism of it and despite repeated attempts by advocate generals, interest groups and others to say this does not make sense. And in a recent decision where an interest group wanted to challenge a decision, a piece of EU legislation, the Court of Justice had plenty of rhetoric about how the EU upholds the rule of law and how the court upholds the rule of law. But frankly, no, this interest group, a climate action interest group, did not have locus standi, and locus standi is the jargon for didn't have the right to bring proceedings before the Court of Justice to challenge a measure. And I think this actually is a fundamental hole in the system of checks and balances. Thank you very much.
I think already just with these kind of opening thoughts, we can see that there's a huge amount here that we can talk about, and we've got lots of questions that are starting to come in. I'm going to take one of them, and which is a specific question about the Conference on the Future of Europe and its proposals, and what you all think about those proposals, and sticking into a much bigger question, which is the question of how much, when we're thinking about solutions to the problems that we see at a European level, should we be using the models developed for national systems? And again, this has been one of the historic challenges of how much we try and reproduce a state structure at a European level, and how much we try and create something different and new that reflects this kind of union of democratic systems, a union of citizens as well, as Janis has said. I just like to invite all of you to kind of think about a really big question, and if it makes you feel less anxious, we can think about a more narrow question of the proposals from the conference, which partly the proposals themselves, but also the way in which that process worked, that it generated or attempted to generate inputs from citizens in a very organic bottom-up kind of way, and then those kind of got lost in a blockage from national leaders who didn't seem terribly keen to take those forward, certainly not at the level of reforming treaties, even if there were some adaptations of practice. Who'd like to step into that part? Sophie, go for it.
Yeah, I'm triggered by many things, but to start with this issue of the Conference on the Future of Europe, and I'll connect it with remarks that were made about participatory democracy, visibility of parliament, etc. I mean, this shows exactly what is wrong. This whole Conference on the Future of Europe was never meant to actually come up with ideas that we're going to put into practice. From the very start, it was considered to be a pacifier for the European Parliament, because Parliament lost out in the whole Spitzenkandidat. So they said, okay, it was an idea of Macron, who at the same time had these consultations in France, which also led to nothing. So if participatory democracy is just a pacifier, a fob to keep people quiet, then don't bother. And the same with elections for the European Parliament. Yes, there are elections for the European Parliament, but in normal elections, and it doesn't really matter, because this whole argument of the European Union is an entity sui generis. You cannot compare it to a state. It doesn't matter. All the basic principles of democracy should be there, and they're not. This element of powers and countervailing powers, checks and balances is absent, and it's getting worse. And this means that power is being more and more concentrated in the hands of the European Council of government leaders who do not have the competences. So they're not held to account, and they're always giving this argument, yes, but there's a crisis, we need to be pragmatic, we need to take quick decisions. But first of all, if you actually look at the decisions, they're always presented with a lot of fanfare. But then if you look closer, or if you look at the longer term, then it turns out that actually that the steps are not that big. Implementation is very weak. And what is even worse is that, and this goes for like migration, the banking union, which is still not complete, even the sanctions packages, which are incomplete, and then implementation is just pathetic. COVID measures, which didn't actually solve anything. Everything the European Council did led to the fragmentation of the European Union. How is that helpful? The only thing that helped was the initiative of the European Commission. And I think we also need to realize that we have to distinguish very clearly in the language that we use between a member state, which is a state and its citizens, and the national politicians, in particular the government leaders. They do not have the same interest. It's a mistake to think that a government leader always speaks in the interest of the people in his country. A government leader has a different interest, also his own power position. This brings me to the other issue, and that is, we need to distinguish clearly between policies and politics. If you say the European Parliament is invisible, you know why? Because it's very good at policies and is dreadful at politics, because politics is about power. I've written another booklet 2 years ago, which is called The Scent of Wild Animals. This is a quote of the founding father of my previous party, who said, what I love about Parliament is the scent of wild animals, blood, adrenaline, sawdust, sweat. And there's just too little of that. And you know what? It has nothing to do with the powers that the European Parliament has, or the way that we organize the debates. It has nothing to do with the language regime. We're not the only multilingual democracy. It has everything to do with the fact that this Parliament fails to enter into that power belt. For example, I think we should have every month we should have a question hour with the president of the European Commission. And it seems that Mrs. von der Leyen said, nah, I don't like that. So then Parliament said, okay, well, then we don't do it. That's unacceptable. She is the president of the European Commission with the vote of the European Parliament. She has to, I'll say it in polite terms, come over to the European Parliament every month and be held to account, and not in some sort of scripted event where she gives a speech. No, really grilling somebody. And that is the theater, the drama that will attract attention. In the past, Parliament was much better at that. But since 2019, it has lost that capacity, and it has a lot to do with COVID, new members of Parliament being at home for 2 years. It had a lot to do with Brexit, because British members of Parliament, they have this real culture of parliamentary democracy, and that is left, which then in turn gave more influence to the French culture of democracy. And I love everything about France, the country, the landscape, holidaying, food, music, and all the rest of it, fashion. The one thing the country doesn't have, and it's the only country in Europe, is parliamentary democracy. They just don't know what it means. So this whole idea of holding power to account, it doesn't exist. And the last element which weakened Parliament is the the imbalance between newly elected members and institutional memory. There were 60% newly elected members, and then COVID hit, and that has really weakened the position of the European Parliament vis-à-vis the Commission and the Council. I have a lot more to say, but I'm going to stop now.
Janis.
Well, thanks. Couple of points. I think there's a lot to say about the question as to what role the European Parliament plays in the system. And also the reference to politics and the policies, I think makes very much sense. But if we look into the future, and then I'll also look back, there are a lot of ideas which are now being discussed, which will strengthen the role of the Parliament, which could also strengthen the role of the Parliament to be stronger as a scrutiny power. If you look into the proposals coming from the Parliament, if you look into the Franco-German report, they're calling for an extension of qualified majority voting, which has an effect also on the Parliament. They call for an extension of the ordinary legislative procedure, which would have obviously an effect on the European Parliament. They call for a defense union. They call for many other elements, which would also, if you look into the entire picture, strengthen the role of the European Parliament. The question is whether we will actually be moving in that direction. Because if Parliament is asking for it, that's one thing. If the Franco-German group is asking for things, that's also important. But at the end of the day, if you want to actually reform the system, which then also will include treaty reforms, cannot go without it, you need to have the member states on board. And the question is, how do we get there? So there's a lot to be discussed in terms of what the process needs to be in future in order to reform the European Union. The European Parliament calling for a convention, which probably would be a good place to work out what the package deal could look like. But I'm not sure that member states are ready to go in that direction. Their opinions there go in different directions. So I think we need to think about actually how we can strengthen the European Parliament and what actually could be done, because the devil lies in the detail. And looking backwards, that's, I think, reflecting something which Sophie was saying. If you look into 2019, the European Parliament was not able to support one of the lead candidates, one of the Spitzenkandidaten. And that enabled, and actually according to the treaties, the European Council to play its role in nominating the president. In this case, it was Ursula von der Leyen, and we know how we got there and what led us to that difficult decision of von der Leyen, which was horse trading or bazaar mentality, whatever you want to call it. But it was the Parliament who was not able to, as they did in 2014, totally different Spitzenkandidat and lead candidate experience with Juncker at the time, which wasn't able to agree on one candidate, but which would have put pressure on the member states. And we have to think of what are the reasons for that. Also, who are the members of the European Parliament really responsible to? The fact that we don't have European political parties proper, the fact that we have been discussing about transnational lists for such a long time and they never became a reality. I'm just saying there are also structural reasons, but there's the element of politics behind it. And if the Parliament is not taking some of the powers and abilities it has in the system and is not exploiting them, then the Parliament also needs to, I think, live with the consequences of that. And I'm probably being less diplomatic than Catherine was earlier. So if you call for more powers over the European Parliament also has to show that it's ready to use these powers. And we haven't seen that over the past 10 to 15 years. I would argue that the current Parliament is weaker than the previous one, and that previous one was weaker than the previous before that. So there's a structural thing moving in the wrong direction, which has to do with the fact that we've gone through all these different crises since 2008, 2009, since Lehman, which obviously strengthens the executive vis-a-vis the parliamentary dimension. But the Parliament also has a role to play in terms of using the strengths that it has already. It needs more. I'm not disagreeing with that, but it also needs to use the strength that it already has. And with respect to the conference on the future of Europe, I followed it very closely. And I followed it in the nascent phase of when it was in the process of being established. And I can tell you that there were a lot of discussion how one could have made the conference stronger than it actually was at the end of the day. Concrete proposals which were discussed, but what one was told, if we want A, B, and C, what you're asking for, we're actually never going to get a conference, which is exemplary for the fact that member states, so it was especially the council who was obstructing, didn't really want the conference to be as strong as it potentially could. Having said that, I think that the conference experience was a very positive one. Not only that it came up with proposals, that it came up with concrete measures which you put on the table, and you can discuss the quality of them. But the fact that they were able to get to results, I think in itself was a strength of the conference. And by the way, it also gave the Parliament an argument to say, we need to reform the European Union, to ask the European Council to start a convention. The European Council disregarded at the time. Now the European Council has more difficult to disregard the fact that the Parliament is asking for concrete treaty reforms. So even there, the conference played a role. I wouldn't underestimate that. It's not perfect, and it needs to be further developed, but I think it's more than just an exercise which at the end of the day led to nothing. No, it led to something, but it could be stronger, and there are reasons why it wasn't stronger, and I think these reasons are important to think of.
Two.
I just want to say on the conference on the future of Europe that I fully agree with Janis' analysis and what he said. And perhaps let me push back a bit on what you said, Sophie, about the checks and balances and the European Council, that there's no checks and balances in the EU. I think you said that the European Council fragments the EU or leads to fragmentation of the European Union. I would not quite subscribe, I think, to this rather drastic view. I think that the way the EU is set up, we do see a balance between the institutions. We do see the European Parliament representing the EU citizens and the Council, European Council representing the member states. I think there's a value in this. And I also think that for the European Council, yes, there is a lot of horse trading. Yes, there's a lot of compromises, but I think for this also forges unity and support for certain projects that we have. If we look at Next Generation EU, so this is the recovery instrument that was set up during the pandemic to support the member states. The EU for the first time took on this very, very large scale debt through the Commission. I'm not sure this would have either happened or actually would have had this united support by the member states to do it if not everyone had agreed to it in the European Council, if this had not been discussed and negotiated throughout the nights for several days. So I think it also sort of depends on where we look at, and I'm not sure that the European Council as it functions only fragments the EU. I think for certain issues, and especially if we look at more sensitive issues and things like Next Generation EU, I think the fact that it has been compromised and has been negotiated by the leaders is what now sort of makes it work in the end.
Thank you. Sophie, I think you wanted to come back in.
Yeah, well, two things. First, to go back to what Janis said, that there are lots of proposals seeking to, including for treaty change, seeking to strengthen the European Parliament. Yes and no. The thing is that the Parliament is two things: a legislator and a democratic watchdog. It's a very good legislator. It's a terrible democratic watchdog. That part of its job is not carrying out at all, and I have describe that in great detail in my book, both my books. The point is that if you look at the proposals to strengthen the European Parliament, they are all about strengthening the role as a legislator. The proposals which are actually giving Parliament more leverage over the Commission and by extension also the European Council, they're all dismissed. One is the role of the European Parliament in the election of the President of the European Commission. Secondly, the smaller European Commission, which is already in the treaties, but the member states or the national governments refuse to carry it out. I'm very happy that Baerbock put it back on the agenda, because in my view, that will be the most revolutionary change of the European Union, a smaller European Commission, because then you cut this umbilical cord between the Commission and the national governments, which has only grown more solid in recent years. The European Commission is, it's acting. I call it like the house elf Dobby, like in Harry Potter. It's completely submissive to the national governments, to the point where it's actually flatly saying, we will not enforce the European law anymore because it annoys the governments. So basically, in all areas, there is now complete impunity, which I find extremely disturbing, very worrying. And the third element, which would give Parliament more leverage, is the right to dismiss individual commissioners. So those, everything that has to do with the balance and the power balance between the institutions is left untouched. All the proposals are about, giving Parliament right of initiative. Okay, fine, but that is not going to change the balance between the institutions. It is really. I'm very worried about that. Secondly, about the European Council, if you look with a bit of distance, I would agree with you. If you look more closely, then the European Council is dysfunctional, corrupted, and weak. And I think it was Janis or Simon who said that. If you look at who's in the European Council of Government Leaders, I mean, there's a whole bunch of them, let's say 1/3 at least, who are either corrupted or weak or leading unstable governments or, all of the above. I mean, there's a bunch of serious crooks in there. And yet they're taking decisions that affect all European citizens, or even worse, they're actually blocking decisions which are affecting all European citizens and beyond. As I said, Viktor Orban would be nowhere. He would be nowhere. He would have been long out of office if he hadn't been a member of the European Council with a veto. That's his power base. It gives him huge power and a lot of money too. He will get ultimately. And I do think that these things have to be addressed because we have now the European Council where all these, let's say, weak, corrupted, etc., leaders are coming together. How can we expect the European Council, as a collective weakness and corruption, to be a stable leadership of the European Union? That doesn't work. And if you actually look at the details, look at migration, has been stuck for 7 years. And all they come up with is this ridiculous Tunisia deal, which sort of exploded in their face. The banking union, as I said, which is in the same shape as the Justice Palace here in Brussels, which has been in scaffolding for the last 40 years. COVID, as I said, has completely fragmented. I don't know how you see the unity. I mean, if you were trying to travel from one country to another, there were barriers again, physical or not. Sanctions, they are always, as I said, announced with a lot of fanfare, but the implementation is shite, and there are always these. I mean, it's in all the areas, but also, for example, Janis, you mentioned it was to mention Next Generation EU. Yeah, they took a decision. They took a decision to hand out big bags of money, but when it came to actually setting up the scrutiny structures, then they said, oh, no, we don't want anybody looking into this. We're going to do this ourselves. Now, if we see the policy decisions are one thing. Implementation, enforcement are two other things. And when it comes to all this money, the oversight sucks, sorry to say so. The absorption capacity, we don't know yet. There are a lot of countries where there are growing question marks about what the money is being spent on. So, how is this a good thing? How is this European Union? And I think we need to keep in mind, every government leader going to the European Council thinks of one thing only, and that's his own interest, or national interest, whatever you want to call it. They will never, none of them is going to put the general interest of the European Union above everything else if that is at the expense of their own electoral interest. None of them. Now, that's not a crime, but then the European Council shouldn't have these powers. It doesn't have these powers. It's exceeding its treaty powers, and I think that in itself is pretty shocking that nobody is raising this.
We've only got 10 minutes. Just a lot to unpack in all of this. Perhaps I'm just pulling together some of the questions that we've got, and we have a lot that we haven't even started to do. Perhaps I could just ask you to kind of pull together thoughts from each of you about how we affect change. I think we've got a lot of ideas here. We've got barriers, and Sophie's spoken very forcefully about those barriers. Partly in terms of incentives, partly in terms of interests, partly also about structures. We've got several questions about the role of national parliaments and how they can be playing a part, the role of citizens as well. Just from each of you, it might be useful just to get some thoughts about how do we move the debate on, because certainly I'm now old enough that I look back to the 1990s and the days of talking about the democratic deficit and kind of the birth of Euroscepticism and all of those kind of things. And we have different ways of talking about the debates, but we still have many of the similar kinds of issues about engagement and participation and identification. So how do we move this debate on, apart from debates like this? Let's start with Tu.
I think this is a very good question, a difficult one also. On an institutional level, as I said in the beginning, I think now is we do have a window of opportunity to speak about reforms more generally, more so than before, and I think it should be used for all of the discussions relating to enlargement, but also democracy and capacity to act. I'm not saying that we will see treaty change anytime soon, or that there's a wide acceptance or wide enthusiasm for treaty change, but there is a debate on reforming the EU to prepare for an enlargement, and I think this is a window of opportunity to speak about wider changes. I also think that national parliaments can play actually a big role in this, and also the national level. So of course, the translation of EU policy, it is difficult to do this across Europe without the participation of national parties, of national parliaments. And of course, you said, Sophie, that European Council is not accountable to anyone collectively, which is very true, but nonetheless, the national parliament should play a role in scrutinizing EU policy also at national level and keep the debate going at the national level, and also keep active in what happens, because it is a lot of impact on national policy. So I think in that way, the national parliament should be more active, as should the European Parliament. And then I think this is a debate that has to be simply kept up now towards the EU elections, but also beyond in the next mandate. And then we will have to see where we go. But I'm optimistic that at least the debate is more open than it might have been a few years ago.
Thank you. Catherine.
Thank you. 3 points. Treaty change isn't going to happen anytime soon. It will absorb a vast amount of energy, and it could go horribly wrong, and it risks the entire structure of the edifice. So then the question is, what can be done without formal treaty change? Various experiments have been tried. Citizens' initiative, that's been quite nice, but it's really not shifted the dial. I think there needs to be much more public engagement at the national level. I think the comms just needs to be improved dramatically. Twitter, social media, TikTok, Facebook, every tool should be used to try and actually show the relevance of these institutions. And remember too, with the European Parliament elections coming up, we are in the world of AI and malign AI. There's going to be an awful lot of malignancy in the debate going forward. So it means the Parliament has got to really work hard to rebut some of that. A third and radical decision, which will be hated by everybody, instead of it being the Brussels Strasbourg gravy train, what about Brussels Berlin? What about Brussels Bucharest? European Parliament actually has its meetings in different national capitals. So that would attract the attention of the local press, and actually it would enable some parliamentarians to see what's going on the ground in different countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm going to say thank you to Catherine for being in here, because she's got to, I was going to say run, but we've agreed that she's not running. She's got to go to another meeting. So thank you, Catherine. Janis.
Europe must grow up fast. That was one of the last sentences that Sophie mentioned, and I fully subscribe to that. 3-4 years ago, we've had discussions about the need to reform the EU. We had the conference on the future of Europe. We were told that treaty change is not in the cards. And I was among those who were saying probably not, because that is asking too much, and be careful what you ask for. I think we're living in a different world now. If you take global Zeitenwende, if you talk about a watershed which we have gone through, which we're going through, serious, that means that the EU needs to be radically reformed. And the pressure is stronger now than it had been. And now, you know, when people are looking across the pond and thinking of a potential Trump 2, now people are getting afraid. We should have already been afraid in January of 2000, 3 years ago. So there is a lot of pressure. And the EU, in all the different phases of the perma-crisis, which we're witnessing over the past at least 15 years, has always done as much as was needed to make sure that the spiral doesn't run out, doesn't get out of control, the negative spiral. And then when it came to doing more, when the crisis was not as immediate, we didn't do what we had to do. All this must now be over. I think there is a need to grow up fast. Having said that, I'm also a realist. I know that even if the EU would now be able to reform itself, it will not reach an ideal phase of integration. But we now need to agree on what the next step should be. The European Parliament is pushing for a convention. There is a strong belief among some parliamentarians that the 14 member states which are needed to start a convention, that number can be reached. I'm not sure that that will be the case. But for me, it is important that before the European Parliament elections, we will have clarity about the next steps. We need to agree on what should be done, both in the context of the current treaties, because there's a lot that can be done. Look, for example, at the passerelle clause when it comes to qualified majority voting, where you don't need any treaty change to progress, but we're seeing that even that is not happening. Because a lot of member states don't want to use the passerelle clauses, and those who agree to use it agree to use it in different areas. So this is just one example, but there are things how you can improve the functioning, the efficiency of the European Union on the basis of the current treaties. But there are things that need more than that. And when Sophie was talking about the relationship, the power relationship between the institutions, I would say that if you look into the proposals which are now on the table, you will see that there are elements which would change also the power relationship among EU institutions. There is talk about in increasing the competences, the exclusive and the shared competences of at the European level. There's a talk about reversing the roles of the European Parliament and the Council when it comes to nominating the Commission President. And I could go on. There are ideas out there, but we need to make sure that ideas are actually being implemented. Again, not in the sense of making everything perfect, but moving the EU further to mature itself, and that needs concrete decisions before the European Parliament elections, because then we will have a new EU leadership, a new European Parliament, a new Commission, and I think also some negative signs coming out of the EP election results. So we need a movement now before June of next year in order to know how to concretely process. And if that's not a convention, as the European Parliament hopes, let's think of other things how we could progress. Like, for example, putting in place of what we call the Wise Women's Group to think of what concrete measures do we need in terms of reforming the EU treaties and what process we need in order to keep the momentum going. Because if the momentum is not going to keep on going, we're not going anywhere. We're staying where we are. And that is not enough in terms of both enlargement, but also in terms of the effectiveness of the EU as it stands. And it's not only about making us ready for EU 35, but the EU as it stands has its deficits. So we need concrete momentum now and decisions before the European Parliament elections, and whether one wants it or not, a lot of that will depend on decisions which will be taken also in the European Council. And my biggest criticism of the European Council is that it is not living up to the role it should be living up to. And unfortunately, the current president of the institution is not helping in this regard.
Thank you, Janis. Sophie, you've got your hand up. You don't need to have your hand up because you're getting the final words to wrap this up in our last couple of minutes.
Okay, I don't know if I can wrap it up, but I want to respond to a couple of things. First of all, I entirely agree with Janis that the European Parliament should use its existing powers. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the themes in my book, also the previous book. And I think there's plenty there. I mean, the powers that the European Parliament has today were not handed to it on a silver plate. They've all been hard fought. That's the way it works in a democracy. That's this permanent that's what balance of power is all about. As I said, I think it's essential that the European Parliament sticks to the Spitzenkandidat and uses the powers it has in the treaty for the selection and election of the Commission President. It should also use that phase to extract real concessions, written, and not like with Ursula von der Leyen, like Scouts honor, and then after the vote there turned out to be lots of little footnotes that nobody had read. But I think, it could also be creative if Parliament says, you know what, we have this confirmation vote at the start of the mandate, but we're going to have another one scheduled already for midterm. Because Parliament can actually table a motion of censure to dismiss the European Commission, but only the Commission as a whole, which, the hurdle is far too high. So rather than saying we wait until we have a complaint and then we table a motion of censure, which is not going to happen, why don't we schedule another confirmation vote? It's like refreshing your marriage vows, and that will give Parliament leverage, because if then the European Commission does not live up to its commitments, then Parliament could decide not to reconfirm the European Commission. I think there's nothing in the treaties that would prevent the European Parliament from doing this. But otherwise, we have plenty of scrutiny powers, budget powers, elective powers that the European Parliament should use to the last millimeter. What has happened over the last 4.5 years is that none of these powers has been used. None. And that is, the European Parliament is really to blame, I think. With regard to reforms, what can we expect? The problem with the European Council is, and there I slightly disagree with Janis, unless I misunderstood. I mean, if you read the treaties, then basically what the European Council was supposed to be was a kind of high-level think tank, painting a strategy for the future, vision, dot on the horizon, etc. But it's actually acting like a government, but one with, I'm sorry, I disagree with many people who say, yeah, but government leaders are accountable to their national parliaments and their national voters. Yes, but the body, the European Council as a body, is not accountable to anybody. And yet it takes decisions that affect everybody. And that has to be fixed. The problem is, if we don't abolish the European Council, then at the very least, it should be embedded in a proper legal framework, with very clear rules about mandate, accountability, transparency, what have you. Exactly the same that we have done for the Council of Ministers, over the years. The problem is that the European Council is the ultimate body deciding about treaty change. And they're also, at the same time, the last ones on this planet who are actually going to change and regulate the position of themselves. This is a problem. This is a big problem. And it's a growing problem. And quite honestly, if I see what, despite all the blah blah of von der Leyen saying we're a geopolitical commission, etc., I mean, she has failed spectacularly, shamefully. The historic moment of the conflict, the current conflict in the Middle East, of uniting the European Union and speaking with one voice. I think it is an unforgivable mistake that was made. Unforgivable in many respects for the future of the European Union and also for peace in the Middle East. So I really think we have to, this is really my last sentence. If the European Union is to have a future in this new world order, it can only be a democratic union. It cannot be an intergovernmental union. Intergovernmental was fine for the 50s of the previous century. It is not fine for the 50s of this century.
Thank you very much, Sophie. As you say in the conclusion of your book, in your epilogue, democracy is a work in progress. And I think that's always true. And I think you've all highlighted all of those things. I'm going to answer one question that's come up, which is where can I get Sophie's book, which is on her website. If you search for her, you will find her and you will find her book. And you will also find the Franco-German report, which I'd also recommend as a very stimulating set of proposals and ideas, which I think is part of this continuing debate that we will have. So thank you once again to our 4 speakers. And thank you to all of you for your questions. And we look forward to seeing you at the next lunch hour for UK